My lords, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to the third panel of our session today, Maritime Operations by the 2040s, Shape, Deter, Defend. In this panel, we'll be looking ahead to the future shape of naval operations across the rest of the 2020s, the 2030s, and how that will impact military operations in the 2040s. So I'd like to introduce our expert panel today. We have Professor Jim Bergeron, Political Advisor to NATO Allied Maritime Command, Major General Rich Cantrill, Commander of Operations of the Royal Navy, who's been in the job since last Wednesday, so please be kind, and Vice Admiral Tom Rowden, who is Vice President of International Strategy and Business Development, Lockheed Martin. So to begin, each of our panelists will give some opening remarks. I will ask a couple of questions, and then I'll open it up to a Q&A, as with the previous panels. Jim, would you like to start?
Thank you very much, Emma. Hello, everyone. As befits the political advisor, I think I'll try to set the stage for this question, this theme, with some of the bigger picture issues, and we can go on to more technical things in a moment. The first thing I'd like to say is that this is a good moment to consider the future of deter, defend, and shape in 2040, because NATO has just gone through several years of a major strategic rethink on precisely this matter. It kicked off in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea. It's gone on since. It was put on steroids in 2022 in the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And as a result, we now have the deterrence and defense of the Euro-Atlantic area, the new force model, the new family of plans. NATO's gone a long way, and there's been a lot of serious thinking over the years in doing this. But one thing to note is it wasn't a one-moment shock. It was still a gradual affair. Deep strategic change often does take years. It's the kind of the Lehman Reagan moment for the maritime strategy of 1980 is not usual. That was an unusual experience. Usually it does take longer to get there. But also, this is also a slightly difficult time to look forward and look at the operating environment in 2040, precisely because we just went through a deep season of strategic thinking. And then therefore the danger is we're going to see the future exactly like the present, only more so. And so we've got to think a little bit about what the challenges will be going into that future that will determine the operational environment. One way to start that is to say that's 16 years from now. 16 years ago was 2008. In 2008, our sessions were GWAT, Afghanistan, toxic land wars, piracy, and NATO had just declared that Ukraine and Georgia would become members of NATO. 1 year prior, Apple had launched its first generation iPhone, and most computers were running on 512 megabytes RAM. So that's the 16-year space. But there are a few, I believe, good operating assumptions we can make about the operating environment that we'll find ourselves in. First, emerging disruptive technologies will no longer be emerging. They're almost not now. Quantum computing will probably have broken the 100-qubit range by 10 years, by 2040, which kind of means there will be no such thing as encryption or decryption. It'll be very hard to do anything like that. Autonomy will be omnipresent. All the challenges of AI will be fully in force, fully in play. And geopolitically, China will be smaller. The US will be larger. China will have been a blue water navy for 30 years in 2040. The world will be a lot hotter and with a substantial welfare cost across all countries, across all regions that will impact budgets, resources, taxation. And one other thought, the cultural piece, which I know you're going to talk to later as well. When we get into that moment in the late 30s, the young officer or young recruit going into the services, their earliest memories will probably be of the COVID era, not before. They will not have known a Ukraine that hadn't been attacked by Russia in 2014. Afghanistan is something they'll read in the history books. This thing called the post-Cold War era, they'll have read in the history books. That's also something to consider about how the mentality and orientation of the youth of the future will think at the time that they're ready to go to Dartmouth or go into the training schools. Just one or two thoughts, and then I'll go. The friction Obviously, autonomy and missiles are going to continue to challenge the littoral operations, but there are counters to that. So I'm not a doomsayer on that, but clearly it's going to be a contest of offense and defense in the littoral. One thing I think we can say is there's going to be a significant, we're not going to be able to solve the friction between the pace of technological development and the relative slowness of creating platforms. So likely the situation between now and at least the mid-2030s, is that we are going to largely be operating on our legacy platforms retrofitted with new technology to work. So this is not, we're not looking at the dreadnought era. I think the next 15 to 20 years is the pre-dreadnought era, and the dreadnought era comes after that. So we're in a transitional phase, a legacy transitional phase, driven by the difficulty of quickly producing platforms and the incredible speed of technological development. We have very few choices. The Atlantic and Pacific are important. Russia and China are important. Crisis management and collective defense are important. Which of these essential things should I stop working on, like the Dilbert cartoon? Competition will be intense across all areas, and hard choices will have to be made by all players on both sides. And this sounds very retro, I realize, but even with everything I've said, because of everything I've said, the Western maritime powers will have to project power and operate forward. The geography alone dictates that. So I think that's going to be a constant that won't change. With that, I'll stop.
Thanks, Emma. Jim, fascinating as ever. And the last time I met Jim, he was hosting a Sea Power conference down in Plymouth. And I noted that it was a really nice venue, Jim, but this one's a bit better. So that's all right. I've got some very brief remarks to make a simple point, that the way that the UK and our allies will have to execute maritime operations over the coming decades needs to change and is changing. And of course, that's driven by an evolution in the character of conflict. And you could all come up with your own list, and Jim's just explained some of the things that suggest that change. Our adversaries are applying novel systems. Lethality has got greater range. There is more autonomy, but there is also mass as well. We heard some of the maths on the Chinese shipbuilding capacity earlier. And so what for us, of course, is that this creates, at the tactical and operational level, an access problem, an anti-access aerodenial complex, which is very challenging for us. And I guess what that simply means, when you reduce it down, is that the UK Royal Navy and our allies will have to disperse more, will have to operate a greater range from the adversary, and then when we attempt to reaggregate to be decisive, will be strongly contested. But I will just expand a little bit more on the evolving character of conflict, but I just wanted to make a simple point about the nature of maritime conflict and make the point that that is not changing and that war remains violent. And if we think back to April 22 and the Moskva, it's not hard to imagine what it would have been like to have been on a burning ship at night that is sinking. Equally, the flip side of that, of course, is we can all imagine, I think, what it was like to be suffering illegal invasion in Ukraine and receiving nightly volleys of long-range missiles coming from Russian Federation Navy ships and submarines. And so the violence of warfare is, of course, unchanging. And then I think the other thing that is unchanging in the maritime domain is its role in economic prosperity. And if I go back to the Black Sea once again, what we see is Russia and Ukraine contesting the ability to export, and then that is fueling their land battles further to the north and the east. And of course, the final point of unchanging nature of war in the maritime is that it is fundamental, of course, to geopolitical ambition. And we see that China clearly believes this, and it's building a force to protect its own maritime Silk Road. But if I go back to the changing character of maritime conflict, I think at the macro level there are three big points I would make. The first is technology, of course, and we've talked about some of those issues already. Ubiquitous sensors supported by AI, low-cost autonomous systems giving range and accuracy, of course, technology. But I think the second part about the evolving context or character of maritime conflict is interstate competition. And it was said earlier, China is watching in terms of how we respond to challenges in our near abroad and in the Middle East. And then finally, and it's been mentioned a couple of times, we're in a warming planet, aren't we? And that means that access will be denied in some areas, opened up in other areas, and that conflict and tension is inevitably more likely. But if those are the macro points I'd make about the changing character of conflict in the maritime, let me just come to the operational level. What are the operational considerations that are in my mind? I think the first is increasing lethality. And we see adversaries using conventional and unconventional systems in very effective ways. And if I look at the Houthis now and what they're achieving with missiles and UAS and USVs, sometimes at incredible range, it is quite remarkable. And what we see is that nations like the Houthis, or indeed the Ukrainians, are able to project from shore into the maritime, and in some ways mitigating their absence of real maritime capability. The second operational consideration, I think, in the evolving character of maritime operations is rapid innovation. And I think the threats will evolve really quickly, and they will impact our freedom to operate over the coming decades as low-cost maritime mass becomes a thing. And I think, Jim, you're right. We're going to be fighting that with legacy platforms that we are quickly retrofitting. And I think I'd also add that our adversaries are likely to go after our C2. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But because if we want to be dispersed, C2 is interesting. We see now on operations, GPS jamming is an ordinary baseline on the Ukrainian front line, or even in some parts of the Baltic Sea. And I think, if one certainty of conflict is casualties, another is that your comms will be denied. I think that's really important. So I will stop talking in a minute. But what's the so what on all that? The maritime domain is, of course, becoming more complex, more networked, and a more lethal environment for all of us, the UK and our allies. And how are we going to deal with this? Well, I've just got three thoughts, if I may. The first I've already mentioned, which is dispersal, but whilst remaining able to be decisive while dispersed. But of course, dispersal can be attacked and has vulnerabilities, and we can expect our adversaries to go after that. The second point is, of course, mission command. And I'm talking really here about when you're dispersed, having to empower tactical commanders, of course, and also senior leaders maybe sat back in Northwood looking at the screen, having to cope with imperfect information and come to the right conclusions. But also, if it's not too much of a leap, I think you can take mission command to when you think about off-board systems. And we think about, if our legacy platforms are going to be having more off-board autonomous systems, how do we give them mission command to achieve our aims? But then the final point I'd make is that it's very easy, particularly in an august maritime gathering like this, to think about these problems in the maritime domain. But it's been mentioned once earlier this morning that the answers here are, of course, combined, joint, and integrated. And I think that's going to be crucial for us all going ahead. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Emma. And it is a great honor to be here today. The venue, it's been mentioned before, but this is absolutely incredible. First, Sea Lord, thank you for the invitation. To the Council on Geostrategy, thank you for the opportunity to spend some time with you today. It really is quite an honor. As a retired flag officer from the United States Navy, I have a profound sense of appreciation for the enduring partnership and camaraderie shared between the Royal Navy and the U.S. Navy. Today, under the theme of Shape, Deter, and Defend, we gather to underscore the imperative of continued cooperation and integration between our two naval forces and indeed the naval forces of all like-minded nations as we confront the uncertainties of the next two decades and really beyond. As we look to the future, it is clear that we are entering an era characterized by unprecedented complexity and uncertainty. Rapid technological advancements, emerging geopolitical dynamics, and the evolving security threats underscore the need for agility, innovation, and resilience of our naval forces. The challenges we face are multifaceted, ranging from the state-based threats to non-state actors, and from cyber warfare to maritime piracy. In the ever-changing landscape, the ability to shape, deter, and defend becomes paramount. And as both our nations and our navies and the navies of all of our like-minded nations know, this task cannot be accomplished from home port. We must be forward. We must be where our interests lie. The concept of shaping the maritime environment encompasses a proactive approach to influencing events before they escalate into crisis. It involves leveraging our naval presence, our partnerships, and diplomacy to promote stability, deter aggression, and foster cooperation. In an interconnected world where maritime trade serves as the lifeblood of the global economy, our navies play a pivotal role in ensuring the free flow of commerce and upholding the rules-based international order, an order that is increasingly under pressure from increasingly aggressive nations. Deterrence serves as a cornerstone of our collective defense posture, dissuading potential adversaries from engaging in hostile actions by demonstrating our resolve and capability to respond decisively. Through forward presence, credible military capabilities, and strategic messaging, we send a clear signal that aggression will be met with unwavering resolve. However, deterrence is not solely reliant on military might. It also hinges on our ability to communicate our intentions effectively and to build consensus among like-minded nations. Ultimately, the primary mission of our navies is to defend the freedoms and security of our respective nations and allies, whether it be countering maritime threats, conducting humanitarian assistance and disaster relief operations, or upholding freedom of navigation. Our naval forces serve as guardians of the seas, safeguarding the global commons for future generations. In an era where the maritime domain is increasingly contested and congested, our ability to project power, assure allies, and deter adversaries remains indispensable. In confronting the uncertainties of the future, the imperative of cooperation between all like-minded nations and navies cannot be overstated. Our shared values, our interoperability, and collective capabilities enable us to tackle challenges that no single nation can address alone. By deepening our strategic partnership, enhancing information sharing, and conducting joint exercises and operations, we bolster our capacity to adapt and respond to emerging threats swiftly and effectively. The world needs us. The world needs us to be out and about, visibly and powerfully reinforcing the notion that today is not the day for your mischief. Today is not the day for your aggression. The forces of freedom and liberty must continue to bear the burdens of world leadership, because there are nations with less noble aspirations who are all too happy to lead without the burdens of freedom and liberty. The Allied and partner maritime forces must reaffirm their commitment to cooperation, integration, and shared purpose. Together, we possess the resolve, the capability, and determination to shape the future maritime environment, deter aggression, and defend freedoms and security for our nation and allies. We must sail with confidence, knowing that our partnership remains steadfast and our collective strength unyielding. Thank you. It's an honor to be here. Emma?
Thank you very much. One of the themes I'm noticing developing out of all of your remarks is technology, of course. And emerging technology is something that's going to shape maritime operations as we go through into the 2040s. Could each of you comment on what you think is the emerging technology that will have the biggest impact on maritime ops going forward into the 2040s? Jim.
The biggest technology. By way of answering that, I think that that question is contextualized in a dilemma, which is a dilemma of deterrence. How the great powers, how the nuclear powers relate to each other in a world of maturing, emerging disruptive technologies. Some of them are more destabilizing of the deterrent equilibria than others. And I think that word equilibria is important because right now we are often talking about these new technologies as ways in which we are going to gain an advantage. We will strengthen our deterrence of others. We may well, but they are pursuing the same goal. And we already, amongst at least in the nuclear states, we are already existing in a world of mutual deterrence to a degree. If Ukraine over the last 2 years taught us anything, it's that. So what is dangerous? What's going to dominate? And what might we stay away from? Well, autonomy is most likely going to have the biggest change, although it's not the most sophisticated of all these changes. It is probably going to have, in my view, the biggest change we will see. It's going to be ever present. It's going to be utilized in ever greater ways. But because it's almost essentially a democratic Newton invention, and driven more by the private sector than the public, it will be very hard for this to be the limit of just the great powers. That it will be wide, and that we're already seeing that in the Red Sea. It's going to be a challenge. There are other areas. We don't quite know how to deal with them. Cyber attack, and to some extent, even autonomous attacks. Right now, at least, what we're seeing is what I've called the Vegas syndrome. Does what starts in cyber stay in cyber? Does what starts in unmanned stay in unmanned? Of course, for the rest of the world, no. But between the great powers, kind of right now. There are a few examples to the contrary, but they almost prove the point. That won't stay that way for long. It will be a very interesting question when we start crossing domains in retaliation to attack. Then the thing I think we might stay away from, at least I have a hunch, I almost hope we'll stay away from, which is the combination of AI and hypersonics. Because I think that is the combination that does destabilize the deterrent equilibrium by putting a government in a box where they may have to respond in a very big way on warning of a warning of a warning. So if there is scope in the 21st century for an element of arms control, it might be there. But I think we're going to see autonomy, we're going to see cyber, and we're going to see, and the other one, of course, I haven't mentioned, space. Probably, and this might be the closest aboard, because right now, the Western strategy for aerospace dominance is to have new exquisite platforms that have incredible control of the battle space, the F-35. If your adversary is cruder than that, then they may well adopt the Nelsonian touch and say, no captain can do wrong to put their ship next to that of the enemy. I will do better in chaos than you will. And of course, if you're Russian, that means try to turn the F-35 into a simple fighter jet by removing the satellite configurations. They need it less. So I think so. Maybe it is cyber, autonomy, and space.
So Emma, we did agree that Jim would do the difficult questions. I think he's done a very good job there. So I could almost say nothing. But if I bring this into the sort of tactical operational sphere, I think one possible answer to the question is that I think there's something around units and what's intrinsic to them or what's extrinsic. And we had a bit of a discussion this morning, didn't we, about the relevance or irrelevance of units and ships going forward. I think that one of the big changes for the people that I want to have a relationship over the coming years, which is with formation commanders and commanding officers, is about them having much more extrinsic capability that ranges well beyond the current radius of their embarked helicopter, for instance. But I also think that what that will do will drive greater inherent jointery within which they operate, because rather than a frigate, of course, a Type 23 is listening for subsurface as well as flying a helicopter, of course. But imagine if you've got all these extrinsic capabilities which are in air, on the surface and subsurface, and you're also exploiting the space domain to your favor or contesting it with your adversary. So I think, for me, when I think of commanding officers, I think that's the future challenge that they'll have to embrace. Thank you.
I'm going to take a slightly different approach to thinking about the future. And I'm going to talk about a subject that I know is a favorite of all of ours, and that is requirements. Certainly, in a previous life, I had the opportunity to spend a lot of time thinking about requirements, the development of requirements, that we could then pass off to industry, and industry could then provide capability back to us. When I was in that job, I would pine for the days 50 years ago when the technology cycle was like this and the acquisition cycle was like this. We had the opportunity to think about the requirements, develop the requirements, figure out how we were going to test the requirements, acquire the capability, deliver the capability, test the capability, and the best part was it was still relevant. We talk about the speed of relevance, we talk about speed, we talk about agility, we talk about all of those things. And it's been touched on a number of times today. But over the ensuing 50 years, Moore's Law has sunk its fingers deeply into how we conduct business at sea and shrunk that technology cycle down to nothing. And oh, by the way, the opposite has happened to the acquisition cycle. Bureaucracy feeds upon itself, I guess. And so if I were to talk about, as we think about operations in the remainder of this decade and into the 30s and beyond, I think we've really got to think deeply about how we start to match the acquisition cycle to the technology cycle. If we're ever going to get to a point where we can develop and deliver relevant capability at speed, we have to take this on. And I think if we do that, and as a person who is now in industry and in a previous life spent a lot of time on requirements, in a certain way, I kind of feel like I'm standing on the dock with one foot on the boat and the boat's not tied up, and trying to figure out how to get after this. But and I wish I could list you 15 things that I think are entirely appropriate that we have to go after. But I think it's going to take a concerted effort not only on our military leadership, but also on our political leadership to get after it. I'm excited to hear about some of the things that are happening here with respect to how to move it faster, how to get the capability out there, get it, test it, understand where it is, move on. I understand that, and one of the themes that came out this morning was, and you mentioned it, sir, was the acceptance of risk. We have to be able to, we have to recognize it, and we have to be able to understand where it is. We have to be able to articulate it to the lawmakers so that they understand that, hey, you know, 2 steps forward, 1 step back is still 1 step forward, right? And I think if we get after that, then I think we can move forward in working hand in hand with industry to deliver those relevant requirements, have them move it forward at pace, deliver it, test it, understand how valuable it is, alongside the tactical operations that you're going to be executing in order to ensure that that happens. I think if we get after that, I think we have a good chance of being able to ensure that we continue to deter, to ensure that whoever the adversary is, on a daily basis, they get up, they look at our allied partner nations, and they say to themselves, today's not the day, and tomorrow's not the day, and the day after that's not the day. We lead turn that, I think we have the opportunity to really ensure that we continue to enjoy this peace and prosperity that we so much pine for. So.
Thank you. I also wanted to ask about the less sexy side of maritime operations, which is, of course, logistics and sustainment, and all of the systems and operations that make maritime operations possible. So I wanted to ask each of you how you envisage those systems changing and improving to support maritime operations as we move into the 2040s. Jim.
This might be my weakest suit, but I would say this: the challenge is daunting right now. And I mean, given where I sit at MARCOM, the challenge is not so much at the structural level, but at the operational level. You know, the fundamental problem is that when you have surface combatants, say in the north, far north, and they did get into a firefight, and they're going to expend their missiles in a few days, do they have to go all the way back home to refuel and to rearm? how do we solve that problem? And we really have an issue here when it comes to an entirely, what we are talking about is an entirely new class of logistical sites and or capable tenders that could do this. But the alternative is to probably a really, really hard-fought struggle to get somewhere and then to have to back off simply because you're out of Schlitz. That's pretty much it for me.
Tonight, I'll be pressing send on a message to go out to all of the fleet to explain on behalf of myself and the fleet commander our expectations of the commanding officers, which is they are ready to fight and fight tonight, regardless of what tasks they happen to be on. And of course, it would be naive to consider that that's possible without the sustainment that comes behind it. And I look now at some of the challenges we've had, just as Jim explained about, how do you resupply complex weapons forward as we operate, particularly in the Middle East. And there are loads of things I could say about how we get after that. For instance, if we're going to have loads of systems operating for our ships, so we're going to have additive manufacturing forward, and all that sort of thing. Of course, our crucial nodes for the UK of those bases forward, like Gibraltar and Cyprus and Bahrain, so on, just fundamental to our ability to resupply. But I actually wanted to land on one slightly different point, and that I think the fundamental thing for us at the moment is about relationships. Because as I look at the problem at the moment about resupplying and moving complex weapons through other people's countries and finding the right ports of embarkation, disembarkation that we need, and the ability to act with speed and relevance, that's all about relationship with partners and allies. And my predecessor, who left just last week, has now gone on to be the Defense Special Advisor to the Middle East. And I've told him if he could just enable us in the Middle East, that would be excellent. And I think he's taken that challenge on. So I think, logistics is important and relationships underpin it, strangely. Thank you.
I agree with my predecessors. One of the things that I worry about is ensuring that we have the proper stocks of spare parts necessary in order to sustain the fight as it starts. I think we need to, and as the First Sea Lord pointed out, we went from wind to power to data. And I think what we're doing today is we are gathering the data. I think we understand what the picture looks like in the future. I think we can extrapolate that to say, this is what the need's going to be as we commence the fight. And I think that what we need to do is we need to be open and collaborative with the industry to understand what they need to produce and when they need to produce it ahead of time in order to ensure that when the fight comes, and I also think that that act alone is also an act of deterrence. I think we should celebrate that, and we should demonstrate how ready we are. All goes into the deterrence equation. And I think if we can get together, understand what the data tells us, understand what our usage is going to be, get well ahead of that pitch, I think we have the opportunity to ensure that we sustain those forces and can keep them operating. Sure, we've got to logistically move the parts around. Sure, we've got to logistically move our fuel and food, et cetera, et cetera. But from the industry perspective, especially in supporting those systems that are going to be out there on the front line, I think we should open a dialogue today that says, what do we need, when we're going to need it, what investment do we need now in order to ensure that we can start to deliver that in a timely fashion to be ready to go. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have time for some Q&A from the audience.